Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl, and welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, where we explore all things compassion and self-compassion. And don't forget, if you prefer, Compassion in a T-shirt is available as a podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and of course here on YouTube Music. Today we're diving into the world of psychotherapy with none other than Dr. Scott D. Miller. Scott is the co-founder of the International Centre for Clinical Excellence and one of the world's leading experts in therapeutic outcomes and what really works in therapy. He's the developer of feedback-informed treatment, a data-driven approach that helps therapists tailor their work to the needs of each client based on direct feedback. But here's where things get really interesting. How does compassion fit into this model? Are there tensions there? Or can a focus on compassion coexist with a rigorously measured, evidence-based approach like FIT? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes, and more. But I'll let Scott offer his thoughts on all of that, both from a therapist's perspective and the perspective from science, and what it really means to balance, or is it integrate, the heart and the data. Stick around for a deep dive into a world where compassion meets cutting-edge psychotherapy. And so I bring you Dr. Scott Miller. All right, Dr. Scott Miller, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Wonderful to have you. You've made such a contribution really to psychotherapy and psychotherapy outcomes and therapists everywhere, including me, with your feedback-informed treatment. Where did it all begin?
Well, I've always been a fairly anxious therapist from the time I was a graduate student and through to today. I wanted somebody to help me understand how I was supposed to work, what I was supposed to do given the person's presentation, whether it was their problem or their background, their culture, etc. And I went on a search and a journey. I ended up learning particular approaches. I went to a treatment center where they were focused on developing a particular method. The research came back, basically said that we were effective, but no more effective than anyone else or any other treatment approach. That pushed us into what are called the common factors. Again, all in a search to try to figure out what was I supposed to do with people to be maximally helpful to them. This work looked at common elements across different treatment approaches. Problem was that who's interested in that? If you spent all your time learning a particular approach, why would you step aside and look at common core elements? And so I had two marvelous teachers early on in my career, Michael Lambert, Lynn Johnson. And at the time, they were recommending that whatever approach you use, maybe it would be a good idea to see if the client thinks it's helping them, if they're engaged by it. Lynn Johnson had created a measure called the session rating scale. It was 10 items, and Michael Lambert had created the OQ45. It was an outcome tool. And the idea was that you could administer it to them on frequent or ongoing basis. And so the team that I was working with at the time decided, well, we're going to give up this search for the right method for this particular person or problem, and instead simply begin to measure. And for our team at the time, we were working with a population that longer measures really didn't work so well. Many of them had difficulties with reading and writing. And so we started to look at briefer and shorter measures. And that's really where it all began, in an attempt to figure out what to do with our clients that would be most helpful. We began measuring. We created a couple of very simple tools. Those tools allowed us to identify individual therapist weaknesses in their clinical practice. Maybe it was not being helpful to a particular person or a group of people that shared a certain demographic quality. You could target that weakness and try to improve that. And our data basically indicate, we have a brand new study by a Dutch researcher named Bram Bovendaert, And Brahm found that the routine application of these measures, looking for the clients that you're not helping and focusing more on them, led to about a 25% increase in effectiveness at the individual practitioner level. So that's been very rewarding. I can step back a little bit, take a breath, feel relaxed, and depend more on the client to help me know whether or not what I'm doing is making a difference in their life.
Yeah. The common factors bit was sort of interesting. That's
Mm.
sort of where you just actually, I had a sudden thought. You were very involved in solution focused therapy, I think.
That
Was
was
it
the first place I went.
that was the
I'd
first
worked
place?
for,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. And
Mm,
mostly because this was a group of people that were very transparent in their work and trying to figure out what I was trying to figure out. What did you do with this particular person with this problem at this time? We were
mm,
creating elaborate maps, and there was nothing wrong with those maps, and
mm,
certainly helped me feel a bit more confident about my work. The problem was in the results.
mm,
It didn't make us any more effective. And I knew there were people that I left the office after a day and thought, that could have been better, or I didn't really help that person. Sometimes people didn't come back. And
mm,
I wondered why. What could I have done differently so that they might have felt more engaged by what we were doing?
mm. I mean, I sort of almost feel like the common factors and the solution focus. I mean, in some ways, the roots of fit are in both, I think, in a sense, trying to work out sort of how to do and what to do, sort of almost is kind of a little bit how I see it. So I have a
Hmm.
funny feeling you were a part of the miracle question. Was that one of your initial?
It certainly wasn't my invention, but I was
Okay.
there when it emerged,
Okay.
and
Yes.
it was something that was done in the moment between a client and Insu Berg. And the client
Ah.
was walking into the office before, and we were all seated behind the one-way mirror waiting for Insu to come in. When the client and Insu walked in, suddenly she said, well, suppose a miracle happened. And the miracle was that your problem was solved. And this amazing conversation happened. And
Hmm.
what we started to notice as team members eventually, I don't know if it was a month or 6 weeks or 2 months later, was that we had all started asking this particular question. Insu found that uproariously funny, told us about the context surrounding the question. And apparently, on the way to the consulting room, before we had seen them, our vantage point was the one-way mirror. The client had said, my problems are so serious, only a miracle of God would solve them. And
Hmm.
Insu simply utilized that. And really, there was an underlying principle here that I think this client had spoken to and Insu had managed to utilize, which was the work needs to focus on the goals of the client. What is it that this person wants? And of course, clients sometimes have a difficult time articulating answers to that. So we have to have multiple ways of exploring and engaging the client around what might be important to them. In fact, I'd argue that one of the most valuable aspects of meeting with a helping professional is being given the opportunity to think through that question.
Hmm.
We're often so caught up, the clients are so caught up in their busy lives and the concerns that they haven't really taken the time to think, what would be different in my life? What would I like?
Hmm. Hmm.
From a fit perspective, the
Hmm.
common factors and maybe solution focused, at the time, we left all those things behind. And
Hmm.
we had thought, we've really got to focus simply on the measurement and what that tells us. But we were sort of back to the same issues and concerns when we figured out that the measurement was telling us we might not be helping a particular client. So what do we do then? And here the common factors really started to help us because it told us the leverage points. What area might we tap that actually has an impact on outcome? Is it client factors, the environment around them, their strengths and resources? Is it something to do with the relationship? Is it about creation of hope and expectancy? Is it about some structure or approach, a narrative that the client needs to help organize their problem solving efforts? Those were when the common factors really started to influence the work again. And together with Daryl Chow, we created a tool called the Taxonomy of Deliberate Practice Activities. You can get it from my website, which helped therapists map their performance onto those factors in an effort to search for leverage points. I'm not helping this particular person. Where might the weakness be?
Hmm. How do you create a culture of feedback there? And I'm thinking both in terms of the culture for the therapist and for therapists to be able to do that or feel comfortable to do it or to introduce it to clients, but then also the having it within the session, perhaps a culture of feedback that the kind of perhaps the client understands too and feels comfortable with, and maybe just in the practice at large. What are some of your thoughts there?
Well, early on, very early on, one of the key findings from measuring therapists' outcomes was the identification of this curious pattern, and that was clinicians whose initial SRS scores, that's a measure of the client's experience of the helping relationship. Are we working on what they want in a way consistent with their values and preferences? And what are they hiring us to do? What do they want our role to be? We found that therapists who had lower SRS scores in the beginning had better outcomes in the end.
Hmm.
And this really clued us into the importance of creating an environment early on and throughout the work that allowed clients to speak up and speak out. Now, I have to tell you, after 25, 30 years of doing this, I've never met a therapist who says, well, you know what, I'm not really not interested in feedback. I really don't want to listen to the client. I know what I'm supposed to do. I just read the lines from the workbook on CBT and then they get better. No therapist does this that I know of. We all see ourselves as open to feedback, but the data indicate that there's differences between us in our ability to create that feedback friendly environment. And I think a first step in this process is to develop a pattern or a way of introducing the feedback process in the work. And that goes beyond simply saying, hey, I really want to hear what you have to say about the work. It's not only about what you say, but how you act before the client gives feedback and after they give feedback. And so in, for example, the fit manuals, we spend a great deal of time talking about what might help the therapist in their words and actions that would create an environment where clients feel open and able to speak up and speak out. And I'll just give you one example. And it was based on, again, measurement, because we noticed that this one particular therapist in our data sample, her name is Wendy Amy, she's a British therapist, had really superb results, overall outcomes. And in talking with her, she did some very curious things. One thing she did was at times between visits, she picked up the phone and called her client. Now, I don't know about you, Stan, but for me, oh my gosh, this was a violation of the therapeutic frame. It was encouraging dependence. We're not talking about putting it on the schedule here and calling all your clients. And when we asked Wendy, well, why do you do this? She said, sometimes the client will leave and I just have a sense that it wasn't enough. It wasn't complete. There was something missing. And so I'll call them up and say, hey, I was having this thought. If you had any thoughts about the session, that kind of principle is what one small thing that therapists could do to create that culture of feedback, being open and receptive and willing to reach out and talk with somebody, even if it's not on the therapy clock, even if it would be considered by some theories a violation of the therapeutic frame, so to speak.
Mm. Yeah. So she was, yeah, she was sort of quite thoughtful and considered and then active in terms of seeking that feedback. And just by doing that and off the clock, so to speak, it creates a different feel for the client that it's okay
Mhm.
to perhaps give that feedback if they get to the end of the next session and they perhaps aren't feeling like that was quite what they were after, they feel
Mhm.
now more able to kind of, offer that. What do you think was behind those with lower SRS scores at the beginning having the the better outcomes at the end.
I think that they did essentially what Wendy Amy did. They made it possible and safe for clients to speak up. You know, it's not universally true, but I would say it's more true than not that we tend to complain the most and share the most with the people we think care about us. If you've
Mm.
had a bad experience at a restaurant or in the grocery store, even though they're handing you nowadays ubiquitously these little QR codes and saying, give us feedback, the number of times we do that is I just almost non-existent.
Yeah.
So who do we complain to? Well, after we have the bad experience at the restaurant, we go home to our partner and we say, that was a terrible meal. I can't believe it. You know, why are we doing that? There's no correction that can take place there. It's because of the care and compassion that we think
Yeah.
we'll get from that particular person.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
part of it, we think, is that the
Mm.
client perceives that it is okay to speak up.
Mm.
And again, I want to emphasize, it's not about begging and pleading or promising. It really is about our whole person, about
Mm.
developing a way of introducing the measures that makes this possible, and then how we respond and explore the feedback that's given. So this is the second part, I think, of the
Mm.
equation, that we typically are not trained how to process negative feedback. And there is a big temptation to view it through whatever therapeutic lens we might have. So the client complains and we start to see this as some issue in the alliance or a problem from their childhood or connected to whatever pathology we might think they have. Instead, again, in the fit manuals and in the trainings, we teach therapists some very specific skills for encouraging the client to speak up. Let me give you one of them. When you're asking for feedback, stop inserting personal pronouns into your question. It's a really challenging thing to do. But what the research seems to indicate is that when we say things like, here's something really common, what can I do to have made this experience better for you? We get a lower SRS score. Very common question that follows. And it's usually a doomed question for two reasons. Better. What can I do that would be better for you? It's evaluative. So by definition, anything that the client says in response is a de facto or at least implicit criticism of the therapist who they may need and
Mm.
depend on for help. The second thing is what can I? It sounds logical. And for therapists, it also often means that we're trying to take responsibility for any particular problems that we may be responsible for in the relationship. Sounds exactly the right thing to do. It's exactly the wrong thing to do, especially in the beginning of a relationship. Because again, if the client answers, well, what I think you could do, they have to criticize you directly. So
Yeah.
leave the personal pronouns out, leave the evaluative component out. And there are a host of other small kind of skills like that
Mm.
that engender more feedback and more detailed and actionable feedback from the clients. And I'll just give you one more sort of piece of information about this, Dan, and that is that most of the time the feedback is small. And that's the challenge. The challenge is that at the end of 50 minutes, where you, as the helping professional, tried really hard and listened, and then you say, what could we do to make this better? Any comment that they make almost seems like being ungrateful for the time the therapist has spent because the complaints are small. In a restaurant, by comparison, well, they didn't fill up my water glass often enough. Well, if the meal has been phenomenal, it seems petty to complain about the water glass, right?
Mm.
But that's exactly the kind of complaint I want to hear. That's the sand in the britches that might create irritation that keeps the client from thinking that, man, whether or not they need to come back or should.
Mm. It's subtle, isn't it, actually? There's some real subtlety to the words that we choose or the phrasings that we use, or it's the small things that we're listening out for and trying to sort of identify and help the client to feel not only comfortable, but also like it's meaningful to do it, that it's meaningful
Yeah.
for them to offer this little bit of feedback because you've set up the preemptive culture, which means that it's okay to do so, but then you've responded in a way that actually makes it worthwhile as well. That it's sort of,
Mm.
and then it kind of rolls from there and becomes more and more a part of how it's done. In some
This is
ways,
why this, yeah, I
sorry.
was going to say that this is why we say that take the time to really write out how you're going to introduce both the idea of asking for feedback and then the specific way you're going to do it. And
Mm.
then record just that part. Don't record your entire session, just record that particular part and listen. And the subtleties of this, I think, will jump out at you often, especially in the beginning as you're fine tuning and tweaking this. The same thing at the end. You're administering the SRS or as another alliance or relationship tool, and you'll be able to hear how the questions may actually be roadblocks to the client giving you feedback.
Mm. So what is the sort of what would be a better rephrasing of how could I do better? What would be the non-personal pronouns bit of it?
Well, these particular scales, ours, have numbers.
I see.
One thing that people can do is simply say, what would be different next time if this score was a 6 rather than a 5?
Ah, great. Yeah. Yeah,
It's
that's the beauty
it's
of the measures.
small, it's very specific, there's no pronouns in it, and it's not evaluative. All we're simply talking about is a move from 5 to 6. Or another way of asking this is, uh, were there moments or a moment in the visit when this would have been closer to a 6 rather than the overall 5?
That's cool. Yeah. Do you feel like the idea of the 10 centimeter line is helpful there as well? It's less about perhaps actual numbers, or have you moved away from the sort of the line on the sort of the mark on the 10 centimeter line?
Well, most people nowadays are using one of the computerized systems that are
Yes.
available, and there are advantages to this. You can use your cell phone to administer the measures. The measures can be sent to the client ahead of the visit, so that you can get started early. And so there aren't any lines or numbers on the scales. This is sometimes a confusion in the beginning. But the way it's scored is to convert the mark into a
Yes.
number. And
Yes.
in general, the scales are 10 centimeters in length. Now,
Yeah.
for me, I still use paper and pencil, and I always have. I have a variety of defensive answers for why I won't move on to the technology applications. But having the numbers and access to numbers does make it possible for me to ask about these small differences without using personal pronouns or having an evaluative comment. And another
Yeah.
element of this is it gets really very specific rather than general. Another problem with the question, what could be different next time, is it's
Mm,
so vague and general.
mm.
So I'm in the restaurant, they don't fill up my water glass enough. The server asks, what could be different next time to improve the experience here? And there's nothing to relate to in that question. Well, you could pay for my meal instead of me paying for it.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to help them improve the service to me.
No. No, it's sort of this is off the top of my head, but it's how well did you feel sort of heard and understood? How well did we sort of work on what was priorities for you? How well did the approach fit for you? And how well did the session go overall, sort of a thing? Those are the
Yeah.
basic four questions of the SRS.
Yeah. And it's kind of trying to put numbers and most importantly, get feedback from the client
And then feedback.
around Borden's classic conceptualization of the working alliance in care.
Mm. And then there's the ORS, which I guess is the
Mm.
outcome rating scale.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that as well.
Well, that's administered at the beginning of the visit. We're trying to figure out either at the initial visit, how well are they doing, or over time to track their progress. And this is in areas of well-being or functioning. How are they doing as an individual? How are they doing in their relationships? How are they doing socially, work, school, friendships? And then there's one last catch-all category that's called overall. And
Mm.
it was modeled on the categories in the OQ45. The OQ45 had 45 questions that loaded in one of these 4 dimensions of well-being or functioning. We simply created a visual analog scale using the domains themselves.
I didn't realize that, but yes, makes sense.
Yeah.
I see
And
it now.
that was recommended. I was in Israel teaching. This is now many, many years ago. And I was complaining about the OQ45. I was recommending everybody use it or a similar tool, Basis 32, whatever. But those numbers should scare the average therapist. I think 45 questions. We're going to administer this every single time. 32 questions. Oh my gosh, crazy. So I was complaining about this, and at the end of a workshop, this Israeli psychologist who I didn't know had been there. Otherwise, I would have been really anxious during the presentation. Chaim Omer asks me at the end of the 2 days, why hadn't I considered using a visual analog scale? And I said to him, because I don't know what that is. And he sent me a whole bunch of articles about 2 or 3 weeks after I got home about simple visual analog scales. We're taking a concept or construct and we're converting it into some simple visual metaphor. Ours was a line, a simple straight line. So how are you individually? Poor to good. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and it's so it's brief, it's simple. People really get the hang of it. They do it before they come into the session, and it's kind of done, and they're curious about what the graph ends up looking like. I mean, it just seems so helpful in that sort of sense. What are some of one of the things that I remember when I did attend that training back in 2011 with you was the idea of I think it was a sort of a kind of rule of thumb that after 6 sessions or so, if the person hasn't improved, that on the ORS, for example, that perhaps they might be referred on to a different therapist. And I remember sort of balking at that and trying to get my head around it. And I think I gradually did over the years. But what's your thoughts about that now, and kind of how we might use the ORS to then kind of continue on to plan for therapy?
So again, part of this for me has always been that I'm an anxious therapist. I want to do right by the client and I want them to do well for themselves. And I knew that there were people leaving my office with neither of those experiences, or they might like me and we might have gotten along, but ultimately I didn't really help them all that much. If you look at the overall research about outcome and ask, what's the likelihood that this client meeting with this therapist at this time in their lives, doing what they do, is going to have a reliable change as a result of the care? What's a reliable change? Reliable change is greater than chance, greater than the passage of time or maturation, and greater than measurement error. So the fact that somebody changes doesn't mean we get credit. You have to, what you contribute has to be up and above those other contributors to change. My mother's most famous intervention as a kid growing up was, it's a phase. Okay,
Right.
You don't get credit for the client moving through the phase. You have to be more than that. And so for us, that's what I was looking for, some way to know. And when we look at the outcome data, 50% of clients end care without a reliable change. And we're talking about clients in tightly controlled randomized trials where the therapists have all the advantages real life practitioners don't. A small limited sample, generally with people with a single unitary problem, and lots of strengths and resources around them. So you can imagine what the numbers might look like in the real world. The point is that many people are not going to be helped. Shouldn't we know who they are? Because if I am not helping, number one, I could maybe change something to be more helpful. If that doesn't make a difference, then maybe I could add other people and services. Maybe I add a group or some bibliotherapy. Maybe I get the client to our psychiatrist or prescribing nurse. And on occasion, doesn't it make sense that the client may need a second opinion? I mean, this is axiomatic in medicine, why is it not the case very often in psychological care? So we just need to know what the parameters are. And initially, I think these recommendations were very coarse or general. 5, 6 visits, you might want to be talking about what do we change about the work. But over time, our ability, given how many clients these scales have been administered to and crunching the numbers using fairly sophisticated statistical formulas, has given us much more exact information. So if you're using one of the automated systems, your client scores are plotted against a very specific expected treatment response trajectory. In addition, at each session, the results from the prior sessions are now taken and calculated into what we call the success probability index. So it's actually giving you a numerical prediction that this client with this background and progress over time is likely to be helped by you at the end of care. And it's giving us, again, I think, a much more specific recommendation about whether it's time to explore doing something different, adding people or services, or saying, I think we've given this a best shot, and maybe you ought to consider seeing somebody else. One more stat. 25% of clients will continue in therapy for long periods of time with no measurable benefit visible. Now, I know in Australia, the government is done this wonderful thing where they're trying to provide access to mental health services to the general public. I also know that financially, there are lots of challenges to make that work. Not only getting the services to the people who can mostly benefit, but how do we pay for this? And generally, without outcomes, I'll tell you what systems do. They start talking about session limits. Well, we're going to give you 5 visits. We're going to give you 10 visits, or you have to see this particular group of professionals versus others. None of that stuff really cuts to what's important. Is this client showing measurable improvement? If not, how can we adjust the services we're giving in a logical, rational, and deliberative way?
Yeah. Yes, that's right. We have 10 sessions under Medicare, and we during COVID
Who made that up? Who made that up? Where does that
during
number
COVID
even come from?
we had 20 and during COVID, and then they've cut it back to 10 again. But it's interesting because often people still might say, "Well, I'm just the client's not really changing, but I'm just holding them." And there's this sort of this phenomenon, I think, whereby gradually, as the years pass, the therapists start to have more and more of their client load that are those clients that they're sort of holding, that aren't really changing, but that are sticking with the therapist. And before you know it, you don't have a lot of space for new clients or for other people to come and also get services. So it really is important in terms of kind of outcomes, not just for the individual client you might be seeing, but actually for the community of clients that you could see, I suppose, and who may actually work very well with you, or sort of get some great outcomes and that sort of thing.
So very true, I think, Stan. That, and make one other point that builds on that. Most of our theories of therapy, until very recently, were based on those clients who stuck around long enough for us to form theories. And in general, not with all cases, but in general, they tended to be clients who weren't responding. And instead of talking about what might be contributing to that, which you call holding of the client, we attributed it to the client. Well, these are the clients that are the most in need, the most mentally ill, etc. I do think it's interesting, the choice of words you use, holding. Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing, holding the client. And by doing so, we may actually be in the way of something more helpful and more effective.
Yeah.
And then, just because this is always the sticking point, whenever I present, people get to this point where we're talking about when to end and when to continue with therapy. these are suggestions. I want the therapist to struggle with the question, not use this like a starting gun in a race that boom, it's over, get out, we're done. It's not that simple. These numbers should help inform the decision making we're doing together with the client.
Hmm. And of course, there's those at the other end who are dropping out early as well. I suppose
Mm,
that's the
mm,
other area I think that fit really helps is sort of to be able to kind of notice whether there are early signs or signals or feedback that we might be receiving that both with the session rating or the outcome rating that might
mm,
signal early dropout. I guess that's the biggest predictor of poor outcome, I suppose, is early
mm.
dropout maybe. But yeah, what are your thoughts there?
Well, by the time given the conversation we were just having about financing of mental health services, by the time a
Yes.
client makes it to their first session, all of the costs associated with that are sunk. And that means that adding a session or two adds very little to the overall expenditure of therapy. And while I do want to, in a single session therapy kind of way, make sure that each session is impactful, the data, I think, is fairly clear that if the first visit is helpful, the second visit is likely to be perceived as additive. And the same with the third up to a certain number of sessions, six,
Hmm.
seven, and then it begins to really sort of level off. So I do think it is really important to see if I can't help keep clients engaged. Again, that doesn't mean I'm begging or pleading or forcing the client to come a second session. I'm trying to entice them to see the
Hmm.
possibilities, to support their interest in continuing to work through whatever it is the focus of our work.
Hmm. Yes, it can be a little bit scary or intimidating for therapists sometimes to really look at that and to examine, those clients that do drop out early, and yet it can be very fruitful, I think, in terms of being able to sort of give our clients a chance to get to that second, third, and fourth session, and where some of the gains really can start to kick in.
Mm, mm, mm.
My channel is Compassion in a T-shirt, and I really appreciated your earlier little nod to compassion, that we are more likely to, yeah, give sort of accurate and reliable feedback to people that we feel are caring and compassionate towards us, and so on. What would you say might be the intersection there between fit and compassion? Do you have thoughts around that?
Not immediately. I certainly see that there is a connection at some level. I suppose I would say fit is the operationalization of one element of compassion. And that's when I note that I'm not helping.
Yeah.
I'm not contributing to your overall well-being. And the compassionate act isn't for me to continue giving CPR, maybe, but to actually get them to the ER, where they can get the more advanced help that they need. That means sacrificing perhaps my own view, my own theories and ideas in the service of better outcomes at the end.
Hmm.
I think there's a bit of a warning here. And
Hmm.
the data about therapist development indicates that, and this is people like David Orlinsky and Mikhail Runestad, suggest that as therapists' experience lengthens, they come to value what's called healing involvement with their clients, the mix, getting into the work and doing the work. And Daryl Chow, he found something that makes perfect sense to me, and that is that when therapists value that healing involvement more, their outcomes tend to be more average or poor.
Hmm.
Therapists who have better outcomes focus on, not surprisingly, the results. Am I actually helping? To me, that is the epitome of compassion.
Hmm.
It has to be actually helpful. And in order for me to be helpful, I have to be able to be present. For that means I have to be less anxious. I trust that by asking the client for feedback along the way, that we'll figure this out together. And I'm going to stick with them for as long as it takes to get them to the area, the person, the program that's the most helpful. Those are just initial thoughts.
Love it. I really it resonates a lot with how I'm seeing it as well. That compassion is a sensitivity to suffering in self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it, and perhaps even to help people flourish. That's a kind of a Paul Gilbert sort of definition, and in a way, it's really, yeah, may I be helpful rather than harmful, to myself and others, and so sort of in the definition, really, it sort of requires us to check, am I being
Mm,
helpful, in a sense, and fit
mm,
really provides a beautiful framework to do that, to sort of not only see, am I being helpful, and also, how might I be able to improve my helpfulness as well, or,
mm,
or what are the things that I might do to be more helpful. So I
mm,
absolutely see it as an operationalizing of kind of helpfulness, and kind of reflecting on one's helpfulness.
mm.
Do you imagine any um, sort of barriers that might arise for people when they feel like their compassionate motivation, their desire to be compassionate, might somehow um, be sort of restricted by having to look at numbers and do the measurements and stuff like that? Do you ever get that feedback, or?
I don't think I've ever heard it expressed in quite that way, but
No.
in ways that sound like they rhyme with what you've said.
Uh-huh.
So most people in our field didn't get into it because they have a strong passion for numbers,
Hmm.
but rather because they're people. They like talking with people and being around people. And I don't think there's anything inherent in fit that is antithetical to the idea of compassion.
No.
I do think it makes you reflect on what that might mean. Let me give you an
Yes.
example that's very current. Yesterday, we had in the United States another school shooting.
Mm.
Two teachers, two children murdered in school by a 14-year-old with a firearm. And what counts as compassion in the moment? Certainly, the school resource officer who ran headlong into the fray, that's a compassionate person.
Mm.
The coach who was murdered, who was trying to in the process trying to move kids out of the way. Wow.
Mm.
Placing the kids' interests above his ultimately his own life.
Mm.
Then you had the rest of the people come to the scene. Some of them standing about, some of them offering food and drink. I see that as
Mm.
compassion. And yet at some point, those things would be inappropriate. So calls for thoughts and prayers, for example, evoke the ire of people frustrated by the number of school shootings in this country. We
Mm.
don't need any more thoughts and prayers, they say.
Mm.
We need action. We need people to do something about this. So while it sounds compassionate, it to many is not experienced as such. The words are hollow without action. And I think FIT is trying to put those two things together. What can I do better and differently? How can
Mm.
we work this out? And there I see that these two ideas exist in a tension or a dialectic that is never ultimately soluble. There's no manual for what you're supposed to do and the steps you're supposed to take. We're figuring this out, following some general guidelines, and then being responsive to the feedback that we get.
Yeah, I think that's really a lot of food for thought. Sort of the Thich Nhat Hanh quote, compassion is a verb,
Mm,
comes to mind. That idea that
mm,
compassion is action. It is
mm,
about doing something. It's not just about a feeling. really,
mm,
and it's about doing something, but it's also about doing something helpful. And is there a way for us to stop and reflect on the helpfulness of what we're doing? But it's
mm,
also interesting. You really highlight too those terrible sort of the incident there that happened yesterday, and yet the courage, really, isn't it? Courage is often the key when it comes to compassion, because you're having to move towards suffering, kind of in a sense open yourself up to some vulnerability, and yet with courage sort of move toward and try to help. And in a little way, I do feel sometimes like, especially early career therapists, and they want to do well and so on, but they're anxious, I guess.
yeah,
And
I certainly was and am.
yes,
Mm.
yeah, exactly. I was just that little bit anxious coming to talk to you today because I
No,
hold you in such esteem. But
no.
but yeah, it's for the therapist to adopt fit in a way. It is a bit about courage too, I suppose. It's a bit
Mm,
about feeling strong and willing and kind of able to sort of step towards that and see, is this compassion that we feel, is it actually being helpful?
mm,
So that's
mm,
that's sort of inspiring stuff.
mm. I think it does help, Stan, to have a community of people because fit in principle sounds rather simple and straightforward, and of course, like a decent idea. But there are lots of small questions that come up the minute you start it, and that can get in the way of continuing with it, especially when your usual way of working seems acceptable and helpful. The field has yet to really deal with the fact that half of the people who begin in treatment end without any measurable benefit from that treatment. That's a
Mm,
fairly stunning, and it doesn't take away from any of the compassion or concern or technical skill that the therapist exercises.
mm,
But it's going to require some openness and struggle to figure out what are we going to do when that's one of our clients.
mm. Yeah, there's a sort of a solidity, isn't there, that we need to sort of really be able to sort of open ourselves up to considering that, having a community around us where we are all jollying ourselves along to kind of do that and to sort of
Mm,
really look at it and actually fit in supervision, I think, is really important as well. Being able to bring the numbers to supervision and have someone who's kind of interested in that same way to sort of look at those numbers and explore it and think about it and reflect on it. Is
mm.
that a part of some of your work as well? Fit in supervision.
Yeah. And this word supervision, we found, has a
Hmm.
lot of baggage associated with it. It means different things in different countries to different providers. The idea of oversight about my cases and helping me learn to apply a specific approach or model is not what fit consultation is about. We've gotten rid of the word supervision,
Gotcha.
and instead we're calling it consultation. Instead, I'm coming together with peers with a focus on the people I'm not helping and trying to figure out what my next steps are and be supported in that by my peers. So the conversations rarely devolve in a fit consultation setting into, have you tried this method or this thing or that thing? Instead, it usually is first about acknowledging that for whatever reason, what I've done so far isn't helping. What could I do differently to leverage those factors responsible for change? The relationship, client factors, hope and expectancy, a new structure or narrative that a client might be able to connect with. If that isn't the case, who else do I need to get involved in the care? And if that hasn't worked yet, how do I work with together with the client to get them to somebody else or someplace else that might be more helpful?
It sort of becomes meta fit in a way. I'm sure that's not going to be quite right, but when we're having our fit consultations, we're still needing to have that real same atmosphere of feedback and that
Yeah,
sort
of
of
course.
feeling of safeness and that sense that the person that we're that we're sort of going to discuss these cases is also, coming from a place of care and compassion. And I think we do just call it supervision here. It just sort of rolls off the tongue because we're sort of,
Yeah, sure,
we
of
actually
course.
have to do it. We have to do what we call peer supervision.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like that idea of a fit consultation where we're sort of, yeah, we're sort of trying to come together to discuss those people who perhaps aren't improving, and what could we think about or reflect on to make those better.
Mm.
What can people do these days, or where do they go to kind of be introduced to fit, or to learn about it, or maybe even seek some training or consultation?
Yeah. So we do have, interestingly enough, one of our what we call the advanced intensive. It's the ground course in feedback informed treatment that we're doing specifically for an Australian audience. So we're
Okay.
changing the time zone so that you'll be starting at your 9 a.m. rather than in the middle of the night. We do have people sign up and are with us through the night. Best place to find out that information is on my website. It's Scott D as in DavidMiller.com, ScottDMiller.com, or the ICCE website. That's centerforclinicalexcellence.com. And there'll be a pathway on the screen to click and find out the various trainings. We offer 4, but the 2 that most people take are the one I mentioned, advanced intensive, and then the second one is what we call the fit consultation or supervision course. And the change in names was relatively new, and I'll give you a reason why. Again, the word supervision means different things to different people in different countries. And when managers were taking on fit, for example, in Scandinavia, some of them said, well, we're just going to curtail or take away access to the supervision you've been used to. So, for example, going and decompressing with a group of therapists, being able to talk about the challenges personally and emotionally associated with the work. Well, we never said that that wasn't a good thing, but some of the managers thought, well, since we're giving you fit supervision, you don't really need to do this other kind of work. And that was never our intention. So we've shifted away from the word only and call it fit consultation. And in the newly revised fit manuals, which hopefully will be out at the end of the year, we have a very specific step-by-step process associated with the consultation in fit. So I'd say my websites would be the best place to go for more information. You can always send me an email, scottdmiller@talkingcure.com. I do respond to all of my own email. If you don't hear from me within a day or two, then you need to check and make sure you put the D, my middle initial, in between Scott and Miller at talkingcure.com, and I will reply.
Right. Well, as I alluded to before and mentioned before we started recording, I thoroughly appreciated the workshop I went to in 2011, I think it was,
Yeah.
it was a sort of a really peak moment for me to kind of learn the model and apply it, and I've been applying it ever since. I must admit,
Cool.
I just to confess, I do use Aaron Frost's DAS10 now, just to
Yeah.
support the local. But you seem
Yeah,
to say
no
before
worries.
that whatever the measure is good. It's more about doing it and doing the
Yeah, exactly
measure.
right.
Um,
Yeah, exactly
and
right.
Heart and Soul of Change, somewhere back there on my bookshelf, was also a big one. So yes, thank you for all that you do and have done, and all of that contribution, and thank you for speaking with me on Compassion in a T-shirt.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Thanks, Dan.
It was wonderful. Thank you.